Oh my god, guys. They finished the game! Shin Megami Tensei V was a game that I thoroughly enjoyed back when it first came out. It introduced a lot of great mechanics and cool design choices into the franchise, and quickly became one of my favorites from a gameplay perspective. When it comes to turn-based combat, I struggle to find many games, both new and old, that match SMT V. There's a level of freedom on offer here that no other game in the series has managed to reach. The open area design allowed for a constant string of fun character progression, and there was a lot of content on offer to boot. I'm sure there are plenty of people in the community that hold this game in high regards just from the gameplay alone. However, that's just one side of the coin here. Shin Megami Tensei V, despite all of its great gameplay additions and revamped design, ultimately falls a bit flat in a few major areas. While I wouldn't go as far as to say the game lacked heart like many others have, it's pretty obvious that this game was rather hastily stitched together. This game always had the potential to be something truly amazing, which is why it's rather frustrating to see those ideas get squandered in the finished product. This is why I was rather open to the idea of this game getting the enhanced re-release treatment. While I've been very critical of these in the past, the thought of Atlus going back to fully capitalize on those ideas and produce a much better game was certainly a tantalizing offer to me. So, did it succeed? Is Shin Megami Tensei V Vengeance that worthwhile expansion we all yearn for? Well, only one way to find out. As much as I just want to dive into the meat of things, I gotta lay my cards on the table here real quick. I received a review code of this game from Sega and Atlus. While I am grateful for this opportunity, I want to make it clear that all the thoughts and opinions present are purely my own. Everything that I'm about to say is how I would feel regardless if I got a code or not. It never has and never will. I think I've demonstrated this enough in the past. Secondly, I want to give you all the disclaimer that this video is going to contain spoilers for both the original SMT V and Vengeance. The game is only a few weeks old at the time of writing this, and there's quite a bit of shit to talk about with this game, so naturally, there will be spoilers. If you want to avoid all that junk, then I suggest you come back once you've played the game yourself. But first, let me tell you about today's sponsor, Asphalt Legends Unite. The legendary arcade racing series is back in this all-new free-to-play multiplayer racer. Either race against your friends or team up in the new co-op mode. Asphalt Legends Unite supports an impressive amount of cross-play compatibility, and it's available on any platform under the sun, whether that be PlayStation, Xbox, Switch, PC, or even your phone. One of the best parts about Asphalt Legends Unite is the different control options. There are two types of driving modes to help ease the player into the experience, and can be toggled on or off anytime outside of a race. This is a great step for accessibility, since it allows for players of any level or platform to compete against each other. Also, did you know that this game has a healthy and active esports scene? Yeah, they're gonna be celebrating their finals down at Gamescom on August 25th. And with how fast-paced and chaotic this game can get, it will definitely be something you won't want to miss. So, what are you waiting for? Download Asphalt Legends Unite right now using my QR code or link to get started. There are even some special launch bonus rewards waiting for you when you do. Once again, thank you to Asphalt Legends Unite for sponsoring today's video. Something that caught me off guard upon booting up Vengeance for the first time was that there are two separate campaigns. There's the original story that we all know and acknowledge, and then there's the brand new story called The Canon of Vengeance. Now that's a rare sight, an Atlus re-release that gives you the option to experience the original story. I think the only other game to do this is Devil Survivor 2's 3DS version, but I haven't played that game yet, so I don't really know. These two stories are entirely separate from each other, and while it might be tempting to hop right into the Canon of Vengeance without experiencing the original story, I strongly advise against that for reasons that I'll get into later. While these two stories ultimately end up being rather different from each other, it's not immediately obvious when booting the game up. The Canon of Vengeance shares the same general premise as the original game, even down to how the opening hours are structured, both in terms of narrative and game design. In case you need a reminder, Shin Megami Tensei V takes place in modern-day Tokyo, at least what we perceive as Tokyo. In actuality, it's nothing but a copy created by God after it was destroyed over 20 years ago, with the world left behind now being known as Dot. You play as a young high school student who, after slipping out of their home, finds themselves in the netherworld. Before they can become a demon's next meal, a mysterious figure beams from the sky to offer some assistance. After some initial hesitation, the two join forces and fuse together, transforming the young man into one of the most powerful entities in the universe, known as the Nahobino. And once we manage to make it back to our Tokyo, we're indoctrinated into Bethel, an elite task force working to protect the world from demonic forces. It's the same stuff that we're all familiar with, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any deviations. Very early on, we're introduced to Yoko Hiromine, a mysterious girl with magic abilities who has also found herself in Dot. Not only that, but we also have a run-in with our new antagonist, the Kadishtu, a faction of demons with a nefarious plan to destroy the current world. While their motivations are currently unknown, they show up from time to time to cause some trouble for our heroes, before eventually taking over as the head honchos for the story. Something that I wasn't really a big fan of in the original SMT V was just how directionless it all felt. Aside from the opening hours of intrigue, not a whole lot really happens for a good chunk of the runtime. The most we get are these one-off episodic arcs that are mostly used to try to flesh out the main cast before the end of the game. And even then, it wasn't exactly the best executed, since some very important characters didn't get the necessary screen time for their developments to be all that satisfying. The last thing you want to feel while playing an RPG is that your time is being wasted. Sure, it was always fun to play SMT V, but the aimlessness and vagueness of the narrative didn't exactly leave me with the best taste in my mouth. Vengeance thankfully has a much larger emphasis on story than the original game did, and structurally speaking, it's much stronger. Just having that goal of confronting and putting an end to the Kadishtu's plans works wonders in giving the player context as to why they're doing what they do in the gameplay. You're not just exploring Dot for the sake of it or rescuing some nameless NPCs from an antagonist we know next to nothing about. You're getting stronger to confront an ever-growing threat, and that alone is an improvement. However, if I were to critique the opening section of Vengeance, then it would have to be how long it takes for the new story content to be integrated. Aside from a few sprinkles here and there, the entire first area of Dot is outright the exact same as the original was. First impressions are extremely important, especially when you're asking players to sink over 50 hours into a product. Asking fans who have played and replayed the same game over and over to sit down and repeat the same content just to get to the new stuff is a bit of a tall ask. Especially in a game like SMT V, where you can potentially go hours without any new story content due to the nature of how that game is structured. To pull my own personal experiences really quick, I remember feeling a tad bit underwhelmed when starting up the new campaign initially. I had just replayed the original game a few months ago, and with the way Vengeance was being advertised, it made it sound like a much larger departure than it actually was. Obviously, as the game goes on, it does deviate, but that opening area of Dot had me squirming in my seat a bit. The reason why I find it to be an issue here instead of something like Persona 4 Golden is because of the context. P4G, while also trying to be an enhanced release, doesn't divide its new content from the old content. The game tries its best to implement the new features and story content into the main story, and is the default way of playing that game. Vengeance, on the other hand, goes out of its way to present them as different options, while still keeping the same structure as if it wasn't. If you were to view the canon of Vengeance as a standalone release rather than as an alternate route, then it works fine, I guess. But there's a certain psychological aspect to this decision that I'm not too big on. At the very least, Vengeance doesn't waste much time with introducing its new gameplay additions and alterations. Let's start with the most obvious ones. For the first time in years, human characters can take the place of demons in combat. SMT IV sort of did this through the partner system, but those guys were controlled by AI and were generally more harmful than helpful because of it. Now, human characters can be controlled by the player, and it's really cool to see this feature get brought back. This is a classic Mega 10 design element that's sort of been lost to time. Having the option to fight alongside these characters also allows us to connect with them more in the story. The original SMT V had this strange disconnect, where we were traveling with human companions, but we felt more alone than ever. The organization of Bethel is meant to be this elite task force, and you mean to tell me that there were no moments to work together with your companions? Gotta say, that was a missed opportunity. Vengeance capitalizes on this by giving you the option to replace some of your demons with humans. There are even a few rare points in the game where you can rock a full party of humans. This alone adds a lot of texture to the cast of 5. The designers are able to tailor the skill selections of the party members to reflect their personalities and roles in the story. Dazai, for example, is a character that yearns to be viewed as a useful asset to Bethel. He's insecure about his own abilities and struggles with his own cowardice. So naturally, his skill selection leans more into the support category and relies more on light-aligned demons. Human characters can be a very useful crutch to rely on during the early game, since, unlike demons, they have the innate ability to use items in combat. Dare I say, this is their best feature. I gravitated a lot to using guest party members early on, mostly so I could see if they were actually good units, and they're okay. The biggest drawback of guest party members is that they aren't modular like the demons are. You can't use essences or incenses to customize them, and they can't learn any more skills until the later areas. I get why Atlus took this approach. Due to the nature of the story, you won't always have access to the guest party members. They're supposed to be temporary units, so any stat increases or essences used on them would eventually go to waste. But at the same time, this makes it so that human characters eventually fall off compared to the demons you can find. Aw, look at Tao, she can heal and use buffs, how sweet. Too bad Eden is just objectively better. As the game went on, I relied less and less on the guest party members, and maybe that was the point. They have their uses, but ultimately they won't make or break a run. I hope that this is a sign for future games to fully re-implement the mechanic, but if that were to happen, some reworks to the general design are gonna have to be altered to find that sweet spot. Maybe a 5th party slot might be in order if they want to have permanent members again. Not a whole lot has changed about the core combat mechanics of Vengeance, aside from a few new Magatsuhi skills and demons. Both of these sort of go hand in hand with each other, so I may as well cover them at the same time. A total of 40 extra demons have been added to Vengeance, most of them deriving from assets created for Soul Hackers 2, though there are a couple of original ones here, and returning demons that have never been seen in 3D before. It's one of those things that you might not notice unless you're obsessed with these games like I am. Some of the additions are obvious ones, and others are a bit more obscure. Ultimately, it's a small addition, but it adds an extra layer of variety to the demon pool. William Atlus, who bought this game on a whim, isn't gonna notice this stuff, but I don't have anything against giving the player more options. Speaking of which, Vengeance adds a new suite of Magatsuhi skills, ranging from the standard race skills, but now there are demon-specific ones. However, your mileage may vary. A problem with the original SMT V was that the game did a poor job of convincing players to try out all of the skills. The default one, a Magatoki critical, was just too useful in nearly every situation. It was a universal skill that could be activated on any party member. It would guarantee critical hits, which means more actions per turn. A lot of the bosses boiled down to a few patterns because of it. Sure, there are a few skills with more niche applications that could potentially be better, but it wasn't enough to stop players from going back to old reliable. Vengeance had the unfortunate task of not only adding new skills, but convincing players that they're worth using over the default. Is the game successful at this? It depends. Sure, I found myself trying out a wider variety of skills this time, but it's hard to deny that I didn't find myself gravitating towards a few favorites. It doesn't help that a majority of the combination skills are just borderline the same as each other. There are all these severe level-based elemental attacks that minimizes the enemy's stats. Useful for sure, but they all just sort of blend in with each other outside of raw damage. There are a couple of fun ones buried in here, but they end up having some rather strict requirements to pull off, to the point where one could argue that they aren't even worth using. I found myself using the Jack Bros combination attack a lot, since I happened to be using Black Frost for an extended period of time. When I did try out some of the other fusion skills, I was a little disappointed to see them being cut from the same cloth in terms of their effects. I wouldn't exactly call these the most balanced skills either. Applying buffs and dealing good damage at the cost of basically nothing isn't the most balanced thing in the world. Also, just like with the Theurgy attacks from Persona 3 Reload, they're just way too safe in most scenarios. I'm noticing a trend of Atlus giving players powerful skills for very little cost, if any at all. They end up feeling more like a feature to make the game more flashy rather than legitimate tools in combat. There needs to be a better balance between damage and resource management if Atlus wants to make combo attacks like this a mainstay. Not to say that they're as game-breaking as Theurgy's were, but I still find them to be a little too strong for their own good. Omnipotent Succession is especially guilty of this. A skill that lets the Nahobino attack 4 times in a row for 0 cost is frankly absurd, especially if you run a crit build like I did. When it comes to the balancing of Vengeance, I'd say that the game manages to keep the general challenge somewhat intact. This version of the game is easier for sure, but it's difficult to tell whether that's because of the new skills in place, or because of the revamped level scaling. Now this is something that a lot of people took issue with back in the original game. The damage calculation in the original SMT V relied heavily on the player's level. A lot of Atlus games do this in a slapdash attempt to balance the games, though the original 5 was rather aggressive with this. It's the most noticeable here out of any game in their catalog. A lot of people took notice that in my original review of the game that I never mentioned this, and truth be told guys, it's because it never really bothered me. Whenever I play SMT V, I end up going out of my way to do all of the optional shit that I can, so levels weren't ever really that much of an issue. Obviously I understand why some people don't like this, but I low-key feel as though the level scaling issue was severely blown out of proportion by players. People act like if you're about 3 levels below a boss or something, it's nearly impossible to kill or whatever, and that's just plain wrong. In fact, in my most recent run of the original game, I attempted to push my luck with some of these fights, even going as far as to tackle bosses that were over 5 levels above me. And you know what? It isn't as bad as people say it is. In fact, I found it to be rather fun in a way. I'm not saying that this system was without flaws. The level spike featured in the last area of the game was and still is total horseshit, but I can't bring myself to fully hate it, you know? With all that said, I still find the damage formula featured in Vengeance to be an overall improvement. Sure, the game is easier now than it was previously, but allowing players to tackle challenges at their own pace goes a long way in making the experience more enjoyable. It opens up different ways to play through the game since levels are no longer the end-all be-all stat. For reference, I played through Vengeance on hard mode and had a rather comfortable time with it. Not as hard as the original game, but nothing brain dead either. To put things into perspective, I fought Shiva as soon as I was able to. This was the super secret bonus boss of the base SMT V, assuming you didn't have any of the DLC. It's usually recommended to fight this guy in your 90s, but in Vengeance, I was able to win at level 80. That's a 16 level difference, and just goes to show how different Vengeance is from a pure design aspect. The alterations made to the level scaling fundamentally changes the way you can approach the game's content. Whether that's a good or a bad thing is a matter of perspective. While I do enjoy my challenging JRPGs, I'm willing to sacrifice that difficulty for the sake of a more fulfilling experience, assuming that the changes are good. I find that Vengeance manages to strike a decent enough balance at this. Also, by handling the damage formula the way they do, it's able to help sell the powers of a Nahobino in a more diegetic way. We're constantly told throughout both games that the Nahobino is one of the most powerful beings in the universe. They're so strong that God himself outlawed them as a fear of his position being usurped, which is why it's a bit lame when the Nahobino struggles to take down regular enemies. It's a disconnect caused by a lack of cohesion in the game design and narrative. If I'm supposed to be an all-powerful godly entity, shouldn't it stand to reason that it's reflected in the core gameplay? The Demi-Fiend from Nocturne is retroactively seen as a legendary figure, but when you go back and play that game, he's mostly just seen as a regular guy by those around him. Sure, he's Lucifer's pet project, but he could have just as easily been wiped out by another fiend in the Gauntlet. His status as an all-powerful godslayer was something that needed to be earned. You weren't just told all the time that you were strong. Your strength was something that had to be proven to others. The Nahobino doesn't get that same treatment, which is why there's a disconnect in the original game where he struggles to take out level 1 slimes. Vengeance leans a lot more into that power fantasy feeling by allowing you to overcome basically any odds with proper strategy and preparation. It's a small change, but it adds a lot to the overall experience. In a way, that's the best way to describe the gameplay additions to Vengeance. The base SMT V experience was already one that I thoroughly enjoyed. I still hold the belief that this game has the best character progression and motivations for exploration the series has ever had. Every collectible has a purpose, and it never feels like my progress has stalled in my quest to grow stronger because I'm always finding something that'll help me improve my character. Vengeance never needed to overhaul this, so instead of adding some tacky bullshit that drags it down, they instead lean into what made the game so much fun to begin with. There's more miracles to unlock, more demons to fuse, which means more essences, and some nice quality of life additions were added to make the experience just that little bit smoother. Being able to sort essences by a specific skill you're looking for is a godsend and vastly improves the system. Also, shout out to the Magatsuhi rails for allowing fast travel between set points on the map without having to go back to a leyline fountain. I was a little worried that these would be an ultimately meaningless addition, but after playing through the game, I found them to be rather helpful. It's a lot better than just picking a checkpoint closest to your destination and just walking there. Some rails even give you access to new areas that you wouldn't be able to reach otherwise, which is cool to see. A lot of the gameplay additions are minor. They exist to clean up any rough patches found in the original game in a way that keeps the core values. I could nitpick some of the smaller changes, like how abscesses no longer produce a fog of war effect, but it doesn't really have any bearing on my enjoyment of this title. The most substantial content to talk about is the new area and dungeon. Replacing the Chiyoda block of dot is Shinjuku. This is by far the largest map in the entire game, easily being as big as the first and second area combined. In fact, it might even be larger than that if we were to count the new dungeon as a part of that metric. Up until this point, the experience felt a little too similar to the original game. A lot of been there, done that, but with a few new quests thrown in to spice things up a bit. It's good for variety's sake, but it wasn't quite enough for me to be fully sold on this version of the game. That all changed once I unlocked Shinjuku. Now this was the stuff I was wanting to see. A brand new sprawling area with unique art direction, demons, and a slew of new side quests and collectibles defined. If you were to take a fully completed Shinjuku map and zoom out on it, it might look to be pretty daunting. However, Atlus manages to pace this content rather well by dividing up the area into zones. It's the same pacing that Strange Journeys Sector E has. You're given the keys to let loose and play around for a bit, but before you find yourself getting bored, the narrative finds an excuse for you to take a momentary break from it. You're given enough leeway to mess around and explore for a bit before having to go complete more of the main story. In fact, you can actually explore more than what the game expects of you for the heck of it, which is what I did. I easily spent hours running around and taking in the sights, coming across some powerful demons and quests that were rather entertaining. It's more of the stuff that I loved from the original game, and if you like what 5 was offering, then I can imagine this being a worthwhile addition. But the thing is, SMT V Vengeance was made for those who were already fans of the original game. If you didn't rock with what 5 was going for from a gameplay perspective, then Vengeance isn't going to do much for you, especially since the game has you repeat a lot of the original content just to get the new stuff, and even then, not all of it is amazing. I appreciate Vengeance for adding a new dungeon to the game with a gimmick that's more involved than the Demon King Castle's fans. That dungeon was more so about executing a plan with proper timing. Shakan, on the other hand, is a dungeon focused on spatial recognition and different perspectives. The main gimmick here are these switches that turn the entire room upside down. The main challenge comes from finding the right switch and being in the proper position to take the correct path. It's a very simple puzzle, and most complexity comes in the sizes of the rooms themselves rather than requiring forward thinking from the player. I'm not entirely sold on the dungeon design philosophy featured in SMT V. I get that the main appeal is the open areas and the exploration, but the franchise has always had its roots in old school dungeon crawling. I'd argue that Atlus designed some of the most creative and fun dungeons in the genre, and it's a shame to see that get dropped in newer games. Compare this game to Nocturne, and none of the dungeons here come anywhere close to the level of creativity and thoughtful level design as in that game. Sure, Nocturne had some annoying bits here or there, but friction in game design is always a good thing in my books. Games should test players in unique and unconventional ways. Too much of a good thing can make you sick of it. So I have no problem when games decide to switch things up a bit or put a new spin on old ideas just to keep it fresh. I don't want to give praise to 5 for the sole fact that it has dungeons because it's to be expected. I just wish more emphasis was placed on more interesting gimmicks than enemy spawns to block your path, so go the other way. And for God's sakes, would it really break the bank to have more varied dungeon aesthetics? Shakan is probably one of the most visually uninteresting and ugly locations in the series, and serves as a blemish on what is otherwise good art direction. So yeah, I can't quite say that I like this dungeon all too much. If we were to just look at Vengeance from a pure gameplay standpoint, I'd say that I find it to be an overall improvement. However, I struggle to really recommend this one to those who aren't already fans of the base game. These aren't game-changing improvements, more so a lot of small additions that add up to make an overall better experience. As someone who already liked the original game, I welcome the new content with open arms, since it takes what I already thought was a good game and just makes it that little bit better. I don't really agree with the notion that Vengeance completely overhauls the experience and is vastly superior. Like, if you thought the original game was some D-tier mess, then I don't fully expect to see this one winning you over, since it's largely the same but with a little bit more. However, if your main gripe with the original game was the rather lackluster story, then you're in luck, since Vengeance is a massive improvement in that regard. At least for the most part. So, spoilers. In retrospect, it's honestly kind of baffling that the story of SMT V ended up the way it did. Pre-release interviews paint a completely different image than what we got. It's only natural that games change throughout the course of development as the team gets a better understanding of what they want to make. But the end product of the original SMT V still felt rather aimless. Like, they came up with a cool concept for a story and knew that they wanted to tackle certain themes, only for the potential to not be fully realized. You know it's bad when more casual players can tell that the game is clearly missing large chunks from the story. Part of me wanted this game to get a re-release for the sole purpose of realizing those scrapped ideas, because I still think they were good on paper. But there's only so much praise I can give to a concept when the execution wasn't up to snuff. I'm sure you're sick of hearing about this stuff by now, so I won't dwell on it anymore. Not like this matters anyways, since the new story featured in the canon of Vengeance is most likely going to have a lot more staying power. The biggest issues with the story featured in the original game was a lack of direction and a severe lack of character development. The party members from the canon of creation were rather dull. Sure, we learned a few fun facts about their lives, but beyond some basic trivia, it didn't really have any sort of bearing on the main plot. The alignment reps just sort of fall into their roles without much agency on their end, almost as if they were included out of an obligation rather than for interesting storytelling opportunities. The closest we get to a realized character was Dazai, and even then, he suffered heavily from sloppy execution, going from a scared but well-meaning kid to an insufferable edgelord at the literal drop of a hat. You know, some intern at Atlus thought this was the coolest thing ever, not realizing how unintentionally funny it is because it's done with fucking Dazai. It was difficult to get absorbed into the melodrama of 5 because there wasn't enough tangible character personalities to latch onto. This made the entire conflict of the game ring hollow. I mean, we're supposed to support whatever ideology we believe in, I get that, but without any face attached to it, all that we're left to go off of are just vague concepts. The best SMT games are the ones that manage to have a proper blend of good character writing and philosophical thematics. Strange Journey has my favorite alignment system in the franchise, not just because the themes presented resonated with me, but because the character drama received a lot of attention. You can't separate Jimenez from his alignment and have the same character, but you can sure as shit do that for someone like Yuzuru. But that doesn't mean that the idea in of itself wasn't salvageable, as evidenced by the direction the writers took with the characters in the canon of Vengeance. Rather than giving the characters massive overhauls to fit a new narrative, Atlus instead decided to keep the general basis, but add some extra context. By going in this direction, Atlus was able to preserve the bits of the characters we liked without making them feel like entirely different people. Yuzuru got the biggest glow up by far. In the original game, he was the poster child for wasted potential. He was meant to be the main Chaos representative, but outside of being Koshimuzu's yes man, he didn't have much going on from outside of, what, being an honor student? In the canon of Vengeance, however, he's damn near my favorite character in the game. Not much was changed about him in a literal sense, rather what we had before was exemplified and expanded upon. Yuzuru is the overprotective older brother to Miyazu, a girl who was dealt a very rotten hand in life. She's cursed to live with an incurable disease that's done nothing but debilitate her for her whole life. While she tries to make the most out of the time she has left, Yuzuru sees it differently. He resents the idea of God being an all-knowing, all-loving being when the person he cares about the most is suffering. Yuzuru is chaos-aligned not for the sake of freedom, but because he believes that everyone should be given an equal opportunity to thrive and live their best life. Essentially, give everyone the same starting point in life, and leave it up to them to carve out their own path. What makes his character compelling, though, is his loyalty to his family, and the lengths he's willing to go through to protect them. His tunnel vision towards Miyazu's safety causes Yuzuru to make rather brash decisions. He even lets himself get manipulated by the demons, even momentarily turning traitor when he's promised Miyazu's safety for killing the Nahobino. This isn't the only time where Yuzuru's desires land him in hot water either, though it's thanks to his companions in Bethel that Yuzuru is able to ground himself and learn to accept the help from others. Atlus didn't fundamentally change much about this character. Rather, they expanded on the subtext that existed in the original game to create a truly compelling character. One that manages to escape the just another Chaos representative status that he had before. The entire Bethel organization is a lot more fleshed out this time around. It oftentimes felt as though Bethel was just a group of kids in the original game, and not some serious task force. Their presence is made much more apparent in the canon of Vengeance, and the game is all the better for it. One of the worst things a JRPG can do is to make the world feel like it's designed around the characters and not the other way around. The player should be a piece of a much larger puzzle and not the whole goddamn table it's built on. This is accomplished by giving us the opportunity to work alongside some of the nameless members of Bethel. There are even a healthy amount of quests that take place in the Tokyo the protagonist resides in. I still take issue with the fact that you barely get to spend any time with Yuzuru and Dazai within the gameplay itself. Tao and Yoko are your guest party members for most of the game, and I get why. They're the main alignment reps of the canon of Vengeance, so constantly traveling with them and getting their thoughts in every situation is a must if you want the conflict to feel earned. But I wish we got to travel with Yuzuru and Dazai more often. You only get them in your party for a pitifully short amount of time, which is a bit weird because the game tries to establish a friendship between these guys. I fuck with that idea heavily, especially with the way this game's narrative turns, but I can't fully invest myself into that relationship because it's not all that present. If you were to ask me, the game should have had a series of side quests where you team up with these guys and go on missions together. Vengeance already has time-sensitive side quests, so maybe they could have been slotted in during a time where you have the full party. I like the dynamic of the slacker, self-serious honor student, and the quiet kid. It's a good idea for a trio, and I would have liked to have seen more of it. Hell, the character depth isn't just limited to the human characters either, since even Aogami's relationship with the protagonist is given further insight. What started off as a rather robotic and distant partnership has now evolved into a legitimate duo. These two guys are a team, they learn and grow from each other. There are multiple conversations between Aogami and the protagonist that gives us extra insight into this guy, which was sorely lacking previously. The decisions we make also have an influence on how Aogami perceives the world and further sways our alignment to either direction. All of this culminates in the end of the third area, where all hell breaks loose. Shinjuku is the best area in Vengeance, not just because it's the most unique and varied in terms of gameplay, but because the narrative is at its best here. Throughout the entirety of Shinjuku, seeds were being planted within the characters. It's only when facing the Kadishtu when everything comes full circle and multiple truths are revealed. We learn that Yoko isn't who she seems she is. Who we thought was a high schooler with the powers of a saint is actually the avatar for a goddess that was sealed away by God. Yoko has been working alongside the Kadishtu the entire time, planning on sacrificing the Nahobino to revive Tiamat and destroy the world. They would have been successful with this mission too, if it weren't for Aogami giving up his own life to protect the protagonist. At the same time as this, Dazai has fully awakened to his angelic powers, and not wanting any more Nahobino running amok, he and Abdiel kill Yuzuru in cold blood. Not all hope is lost, however, since, remember, Tsukiyomi and Susanoo are brothers. This means that Koshimizu and the protagonist are able to fuse together to create an all-new Nahobino. Hell yes. This is the kind of stuff that was sorely missing from the original game. Characters having agency in the narrative, their choices leaving an impact on those around them. Me actually giving a shit when one of them is killed off, and it's fucking Yuzuru of all people. When I finally got the new Nahobino form, I was fucking ready to throw down with Yoko and Dazai. Those bastards killed my friend and my companion, and I wanted revenge. And experiencing those feelings is when the name of the game finally clicked with me. Shin Megami Tensei V Vengeance is a strange title out of context, but if one thing is for certain, Vengeance is a main theme of this game's narrative, and it's not just limited to Yoko. Every major character is motivated by revenge in one way or another. Dazai and Abdiel want to ensure God's position at the top once it was stolen by Lucifer, and are willing to do anything to accomplish that goal. Miyazu blames the protagonist and Koshimizu for Yuzuru's death, so her and Khonshu plot their downfall. Yakuma was on a quest to kill all demons since they're the ones responsible for the death of his parents. Revenge even becomes our motivator for the endgame. It becomes less about protecting the world and more so about avenging the ones closest to us. I like how when Dazai shows up at the entrance to the Empyrean, the protagonist just cuts right to the chase. He's just ready to throw hands the moment they lay eyes on each other. Their previous friendship be damned. I would argue that the price of revenge is this game's core theme. What lengths are you willing to go through to see your quest until the end? Are you willing to abandon your morals and take the lives of innocent people if push comes to shove? Are you willing to let go of it all if it means putting an end to that cycle? These are questions that the game presents and even serve as the basis for the alignment lock this time around. It's less about the standard law versus chaos debate, rather it's about feeding that cycle of revenge. Do we abandon our quest for vengeance for the sake of creating a new world where everyone has a happy life? Or do we feed into it, discard our moral compass for the sake of seeing our vision through to the end? Both of these endings have their upsides and downsides. Creating a new world through the throne might bring about a temporary peace, but it can't last forever. At some point or another, a new Nahobino will rise through the ranks and take us down, asserting their dominance throughout the universe. It's happened in the past and will continue to happen in the future. Ultimately, it's a futile effort and only really serves to benefit our immediate group of friends. Destroying the entire process of creation sounds rather tempting. It transcends the will of the angels and that old order, leaving nothing behind but a new beginning. One where we can hopefully do better than last time. But we also need to consider the consequences of going down that path. What if the world we have now is the best one we got? What if the new world we forge is just as bad, if not worse for humankind? We also need to consider all the lives we're robbing by destroying everything. All of the innocent people we harmed in our quest for what we believe is right. With no neutral path to speak of, Vengeance sets itself apart from nearly every entry in this franchise, and it's a welcome change. I wouldn't mind future games ditching neutral in the future if it allows for a more interesting discussion of these ideas. Vengeance puts in a lot of effort to improve the story of the original SMT V, and while I find its attempts rather successful, it doesn't exist without flaws. The biggest one to me is just how shackled it is to the original game. Vengeance is at its best when it steps away and does its own thing, but due to the nature of this game being a re-release, a lot of that old story's DNA rears its head in ways that are a bit distracting. The canon of Vengeance expects you to have played the canon of Creation before diving in. While people might try to tell you that you can go in without having played the original game, there will be times where certain concepts and ideas won't make a whole lot of sense. There's information that's relevant to the canon of Vengeance that's only explained in the original game. Why is Lucifer here at the end of the game? Why does Abdiel suddenly have a new form? Who is the Demon King, and why is it important that they're taken out? We don't even get to see this happen in the canon of Vengeance, but the game already assumes you know about all this stuff, so it doesn't bother to re-explain it to you. Someone who's only played the canon of Vengeance will have no idea what's going on during the final area of the game. The race for the Throne of Creation is a massive part of the original game. We got to go to the Bethel Summit and meet with all the differing branches. Their encounter with the protagonist clues them in that the throne is up for grabs, so everyone sort of just bails and does their own thing. The last area is motivated heavily by this idea, but in the Vengeance route, it's completely glossed over. We're just unceremoniously told about the Throne of Creation, and are expected to seize it to repair the world. This only makes sense if you played both routes, and in a way, it can be seen as encouragement. But as I said, a good majority of the Vengeance route is the same as the original game, both in terms of narrative and gameplay content. It's only at about the halfway mark do these stories differentiate from each other. I suppose you could just New Game Plus it and speed through everything for the sake of the cutscenes, but that's a bit lame if you ask me. You can tell that the team behind Vengeance wanted to do more with the story, but were unfortunately limited when it came to resources and what they could afford to change from the original. What this results in is a game that has amazing highs, but still feels a bit held back. Like, it can't be too different, or else we'll be unable to reuse assets. This is probably why Lucifer is the final boss again. He has next to nothing going on in the canon of Vengeance, but here he is as the final boss, and it's easier than the battles you had to do to get to him. It's also probably why Aogami comes back after the Tiamat fight. We can't make too many changes or else we'll run out of money, and that's a damn shame. I also can't quite say I'm the biggest fan of Yoko. Don't get me wrong, I like what she's meant to represent and her role in the story, but aside from that, I find her characterization to be rather unbearable. Like 90% of her dialogue is this overly pessimistic pseudo-intellectual crap. She goes on and on about how flawed the current status quo is, and wants nothing more than for it to all be eradicated. That's fine, but the issue is that there isn't a whole lot to her aside from the edgy dialogue. If you want an example of what I mean by this, listen to her advice on how to deal with Sahori's bullying problem.
You really want to help? Then ask yourself if you're willing to kill the girls bullying her.
Why the fuck would you say that, Yoko? I hear people try to defend her and say that she's a realistic depiction of teenagers that thinks they're smarter than they actually are, but like, you guys know she's not actually a teenager, right? Even if she were one, I don't buy for a second that a real person would talk like this, or view things in as much as a black and white view as she does. Teenagers are emotional and don't always think rationally. This is something that SMT V loves to play with. Both Yuzuru and Dazai are perfect examples of characters that have strong convictions, but their age and lack of maturity can get the better of them. It also helps that these two characters have more going on with them than their alignments. I don't find Yoko to be a particularly round character. I fuck with her purpose in the story a lot. A character so deeply obsessed with getting revenge that they completely lose themselves to it. They start to make connections that don't exactly exist, but the thought of them reaffirms their biases. That's really cool. In fact, it actually reminds me a lot of Shohei Yakumo, but even then, the canon of Vengeance was more willing to explore his innate hypocrisy. He wants to rid the world of demons, but finds himself growing attached to his demonic partner, to the point where he begins to even question his motivations. That's great character writing. Yoko doesn't get anything like this, and as a result, her character lacks any sort of humanity to grasp onto. You side with Yoko because you thoroughly agree with her perspective, not because she's an amazingly complex character or anything. I do appreciate Vengeance for allowing both Yoko and Tao opportunities to express their beliefs when you finish certain side missions, but unfortunately, they end up falling into a pattern of, I believe in this, I am the opposite alignment, so I disagree with your perspective, I sure do hate this part of mankind, I get it. You know it's bad when the characters themselves get annoyed with Yoko's shit. It's like they're overcompensating for the lack of character interactions in the original game by having her interject in any and all opportunity. That's not to say that I despise Yoko or anything, but her characterization is clearly the weakest of the cast, which sucks to see because I could imagine her blunt attitude being a standout. At the very least, she gets shit done when it's time to act. She does have agency, which is always a good thing. It just doesn't save her from that awful dialogue. The biggest compliment I can offer to Shin Megami Tensei V Vengeance is how it manages to realize most of the potential of the original game. Vengeance is bigger, offers more to do, has a new, much better story, and is just a good package all around. There are a lot of smaller changes and additions that I didn't mention here, but I'll leave that up to someone else to do. But there is one thing that I want to say. I don't think people are making a big enough stink over the fact that Atlus has now delisted the original SMT V from digital storefronts. People have been surprisingly okay with this, and I don't know why. Like, this isn't some licensed game from the early 2000s, where contracts expire with no interest in renewal. This is a game that Atlus fully owns, that they chose to get rid of to force people to buy Vengeance. While I do find this to be the superior version of the game, the fact that you can't even buy the original anymore without hunting down a physical copy sets an awful standard. Regardless of how you argue this game getting delisted is a bad thing. It's anti-preservation and anti-consumer, and this better not be the standard going forward. There is always merits to visiting the original piece that a remaster is attempting to update, and by trying to hide it or remove people's ability to experience it, you're devaluing the work that hundreds of people put into it. Of course, there are still ways to play the game now, but I don't want this to become the future of this company. It doesn't change my outlook on Vengeance, but I don't want to support this practice, and neither should you. I like Shin Megami Tensei V Vengeance, but when it comes to Atlus re-releases, I sort of hope this is the last one for a long time. I want to go back to the days when buying an Atlus game meant you were guaranteed a great experience. I was willing to make an exception this time because the original 5 was a bit of a mess, but I don't want to have these caveats going forward. I don't want Metaphor to come out only to be forced to rebuy it again in a few years. I'd rather see the resources go towards making new and original games. But if these have to exist, then they should be making them like Vengeance. Take games that were obviously compromised due to a rough development, polish them up, and deliver an experience that fully realizes the game's potential. Way to go, guys. You finally finished it.